The following program is an original production of WICC PBS Chicago. Closed captioning for the professors is provided in part by the Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury and wrongful death law firm in Chicago.
What works and what doesn't when it comes to handling discipline issues at school? Are suspensions still a good idea? What's being done to solve the problem of truancy? All of that and more is coming up next on today's edition of The Professors. Joining us to talk about school discipline, including truancy and suspensions, are Liz Dozier, principal at Finger High School, Dr. Nick Panomitros, attorney and professor at UIC and Loyola University, Dr. Larry Muhammad, national director of the Muhammad University of Islam, and Dr. Khalil Murar, professor of political science at Governor State University. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, are these issues around discipline, are they worse now than they've been in the past? Our conversation today is going to be around truancy, suspensions, around corporal punishment. But you two work with children every single day in the school system. Is discipline a greater issue now than it was in the past, and what are you seeing every day in your work?
I don't think it's any bigger than what it has been and what our challenges have been over the past 10 or 20 years. I personally have been doing this for 10 years in terms of administration, but I think in a lot of ways it's improved in terms of our approach and trying to do some different things with young people and not being so punitive.
Okay.
Trying to move away from suspensions and the harsher zero tolerance style of leadership. But of course we're dealing with the same issues. Okay. And some of the issues have changed, you know, with social media and the internet. That's become a new
So
problem.
do you suspend students at your school?
We do, but not often.
Okay, cool.
But you know, suspension is part of the policy if needed.
One thing that I've read recently is that suspension is really sort of becoming the way to deal with discipline issues. I just recently did a study of the California school system, and they had over 700,000 suspensions in the 2011-2012 school year. And what they're finding is that this number has gone up drastically over the past 10, 20 years. And so what's happening in many schools, and I would say you're probably at a unique advantage because you're in a private, religiously based school, and you probably have a little bit better hold of discipline issues. But I would imagine that you probably deal with everything that we can imagine, and you're kind of in the belly of the beast in that way. How do you deal with discipline at your high school?
Yeah, so I just like to touch base on some of the stats you gave around the California schools. And I believe I read the same study, and it talked about how students were being suspended for small things, like being late for class or not being prepared, or smaller
or cell
things.
phone usage.
Cell phone, very small things. And then when the state started to kind of become more cognizant of this and kind of redirect that, they saw suspensions drop. It's something that we practice at Finger High School, just being really cognizant of when students are actually not in school. I think that it's a last resort option. We've actually been a leader in restorative justice in the last several years, in the last 3 years, I would say for sure. There was just a recent report done on us by the Novo Foundation, as well as we're speaking at Harvard in terms of the restorative justice and really finding alternate ways to address the student behavior, and not just address it and say, hey, don't do that, but really teaching kids what the expectation is.
So give me an example of that. So you're talking about a restorative justice program. What does that look like for a kid that walks in and they say they have an issue with a teacher, they're talking back and forth, and they're being disruptive in class? What do you do with them?
So first, we have a full-time culture and climate coordinator, Robert Spicer, who's absolutely phenomenal. And so he runs our peace circles and our peer jury, which are two, I would say, pillars within our school. And so for those who aren't familiar, our peace circles are, and they happen not just at Finger, but in other Chicago public schools, but where students get together and kind of talk about issues that they might have. So let's say the student did get into it with the teacher and wasn't happy with what the teacher said or whatever that's there. He would actually facilitate a talking circle, and it sounds so small, and people say, well, how could that possibly work in terms of changing student behavior? But it actually does. There's been a lot of research done on restorative justice, and actually the Department of Education, as well as others, has begun to really pick this up and really build this into uniform discipline codes.
Now, one of the things that I wanted to come to this side of the table about is, you guys both mentioned to me before the show began that you were very comfortable talking about what is happening in other countries around the issue of discipline. It's no secret that if you go to a place like China or Japan, many people know just from watching television, the news, that sort of thing, they're not necessarily having the same issues of discipline that the American schools are having. What is it that's happening in those places that's not happening here?
I think it's the family unit's a little bit stronger, and the freedom that our children have here is part of the issue. I mean, I know from countries that I visited, and as a political scientist studying some of these countries, that if teacher sends a note home or the principal complains, you'd get your behind whooped. But over here, nowadays, that's not the case anymore. The child, if he's screamed at, shouted at, or in any way disciplined, calls the police, the parents don't have the ability to discipline them. I'm not saying that that's correct, but that's sort of an explanation in those countries. It's almost like it was here 40, 50 years ago. So you have that freedom, and I don't know that suspension necessarily is the method. If someone's doesn't want to be in school and you tell them you're suspended, well, the kid's happy, right? So I think that your program, what you're trying to do, is actually excellent, because that child would be happy. I don't want to be here in school. They're suspending me.
And the studies have shown that those kids that do face suspension, then they end up basically being at risk for not coming back to school, or teen pregnancy, or crime and violence. Those things are very, very clear.
And one thing I want to add is that when you suspend someone who perhaps is deserving of that kind of punishment, and I agree with Nick, it's not one of those punishments that actually works. They, generally speaking, go back to a home environment that really does not encourage learning, does not encourage discipline, and generally speaking, they're on their own. Let's just be blunt about this, right? So they're not going to a home environment that is warm, that resuscitates the child's attitude. Instead, they're sort of encouraged to accumulate the kind of, I guess, toxins, if you will, social toxins and other things that really have resulted in the behavior that created the suspension in the first place. So I'm not sure, and I'm glad schools like Finger are doing things like restorative justice and peace circles and things like that, because there has to be an alternative to those things. And my focus really is on policy, like what are the policies that actually work and which ones do not work. I think policies of suspension, generally speaking, have not worked. They have failed to actually correct the behavior that they're meant to correct. Instead, there are alternatives that we should examine. In addition to the role of the family, as Dr. Nick's pointing out, I think we ought to have a sort of a partnership between the school system on the one hand, policymakers on the other hand, to create policies that are optimal for the nurturing learning environment that we need to have for children.
Here's an interesting angle to this story that I almost hate to bring up, because it tends to be the angle that we have to talk about really in every punitive aspect of our society, whether it be the criminal justice system or even in schools, but it's the racial angle. And really thinking about the fact that if you look at this problem in Chicago, secondary school suspension rates, African Americans are 25% of who are suspended, Latinos 12%, people of European descent 7%. Actually, this is a national number.
Yeah, it's national.
So, and it's just as bad in the city of Chicago as well. Why do you think that the racial, we need to talk about race in this? What's happening racially in these classrooms? Is it that these kids are just acting worse, or what's going on? Why are those disparities there?
There seems to be a consensus that zero tolerance, this policy, this broad policy that we have applied in our schools, tends to apply towards African Americans first and foremost. Let's be honest about this, right? I mean, zero tolerance does not apply in the same manner that it does to African Americans. In other words, you know, you could have somebody of European descent and somebody of African descent, and they commit the same sort of crime, if you will. You know, that's when it comes to the African American child, that's when zero tolerance begins to actually take root and begins to be applied to that child, not so much with the child of European descent. We do have a racial disparity problem, let's face it, and the question is, how do we best deal with racial disparity, especially when it comes to punitive measures at school at stake? I'm not sure we're comfortable with any one answer, but there has to be an answer that we should, as a society, enjoin.
Well, it's no secret that the Nation of Islam has been very effective at instilling discipline in young men, really taking troubled communities and students who are most at risk and really building ministries off of those students. What is it that you all have tapped into that maybe the public school system or society at large has not figured out?
Well, I think initially, you know, that at the core of the philosophy, of course, we separate our children, the boys from the girls. That helps. Because I've been in all of the different environments, and boys and girls together.
Well, that's no fun now.
You know,
Come on. I mean, when I was in school, I wanted to be around the girls.
It's a lot of fun. And, you know, they kind of stir things up. So as soon as you separate them, you notice a big difference, first of all. You know, and part of the dilemma when we talk about, you know, youth and students being successful, this problem, what you're bringing up, I mean, it starts at kindergarten, starts in preschool, and especially with the boys and black boys, I mean, the tolerance level, there's not much tolerance, and boys play different, they interact different, they communicate differently. So we know, and from research, we know that is just not a lot of tolerance for them. So in our environment, having them separated and, you know, doing certain, we drill them in the morning, and we give them an opportunity, which is not just discipline, but it's also physical. It kind of helps them to come into focus, whereas most children, they're coming into school and the environment that they're coming from with television and it's anti-discipline a lot of times. They, you know, they don't have much structure.
I'll come up here in a second, but I'm sure that the faith-based piece helps a lot in that, because there's a connection to sort of a higher reason for discipline that may not exist in a traditional setting.
But that connection's also caring. Now, most of those kids and families that attend that type of school, parochial school, care. So punitive, and you do use punitive methods at your school. It seems to work there because when someone cares and then they're told you're going to be suspended, it means something. But if someone doesn't care, it's like arguing with somebody that doesn't care. If someone doesn't care, you're never going to win.
Yeah,
right?
That makes sense, That makes a lot of sense.
So you have to look at it that way.
Let's talk about caring, and let's talk about beatings now as well, okay? Because, you know, those old scripture says, spare the rod and spoil the child, right? So, wonderful transition, right? If you think about this, corporal punishment is still in the books in a variety of states. So, Alaska, California, Illinois, Michigan, Nevada, New York, Utah, and Washington all allow corporal punishment. In their private schools, even though they're banned in public schools. There also, I believe, are 19 other states that allow for corporal punishment. And there are even 3 states that allow for corporal punishment in preschools for younger children. So is corporal punishment, now I know this is kind of like far out here, should we just be spanking these kids more?
No, I went to school where there was corporal punishment. It was the norm. And I myself have been subject to brutal beatings, and I've seen other kids that have been subject to brutal beatings, right, with a stick, a very thick stick. No, it doesn't help, you know. I mean, so I would get beaten very often for not having good handwriting, and instead my handwriting got worse.
How is it now?
It's hideous. It's the worst it's ever been.
But you're a professor.
Well,
you're
yeah,
okay.
It should be, yeah.
Well, I never got beating, and my handwriting's bad, so I don't know what to say.
And then you get beaten for not doing mathematics right. It didn't make me do math right. It actually made me do it worse.
Okay.
I got beaten for not knowing, for example, the difference between H and O and the H2O, and I still don't, and I'm sort of studying, just talking about it because of the fear of punishment. The truth is, no, it doesn't work. I think, look, people that want to talk about corporal punishment as being an answer have essentially exhausted all means for discipline. And it really is. It's the refuge of those that do not know how else to deal with the problem. I don't think that's what we should inflict on our children, That is not to say that I completely believe that all punishment should be off the table. I do, however, believe that corporal punishment is the worst form of punishment, the least effective, even though it does provide results immediately. It creates a silence that the abuser wants to create. It doesn't work in terms of improving behavior.
Okay.
I agree, but a whack on the behind by someone who cares and, of course, not going crazy. We've all slapped our children on the hand. Don't do that. They don't do it. But it's got to be administered correctly. But I mean, your situation, I think, I agree with you that it's
I've never
too much.
I've never exposed and experienced it myself. So obviously, you then would be the expert here on this conversation because you have. And
First-hand experience.
yeah, and I haven't. However, I do understand. I mean, as a parent, we spank our children, and we spank them in love. We spank them carefully. We don't spank them very often. But there are times and places where they need to be disciplined. And once again, I don't like doing it, but the reality is that it happens. So with students in our culture, and you mentioned this whole lack of discipline, really this notion of discipline is really countercultural. Because in every space else in society, they're sort of free to be and do, and then you put them in these classrooms and you make them sit quietly with no internet and no cell phone, et cetera. So I know, for instance, I want to come back to you again on this. You talked about restorative justice, and I'm sure as well because I hear that you're one of the rock star principals out there. Okay, so I'm assuming that relationships are very important as well. Why don't you give me an example of just a situation in the school? You got a rough student, and what did you do?
Yeah, I think it all boils down to relationships. I think that corporal punishment only gets you basically nowhere with teenagers. I don't think it really gets you from point A to point B. And relationships yield a much better result. So I can think of a particular student, Veda, who came to us her freshman year. She came from, I think, what you would think of as just one of the worst family and home situations I can think of, and it was, of course, from that home situation and not having that lack of structure at home, acting out, fighting, these different things. And over the course of the time that she was with us through relationships, really changed the course of her life. She's now a freshman at Illinois College, doing well. And I think those relationships, it's a small thing like checking in, how are you doing? It's almost I compare it to parenting. I tell my staff, whether you are in the lunchroom or you're in the main office or you're the principal or a teacher or you're a security officer at the front door, your job is to connect with kids, to make them feel like someone really cares about them. And just them knowing that you notice maybe they got a haircut or maybe they're a little disheveled today, and you check in, that relationship can change the course of a child's life.
That's very, very interesting.
Do you use corporal punishment at your schools?
We do. Corporal punishment we use it, but we don't use it a lot.
Certainly.
I mean, the key, and you said it, the key is care. Care. You have to care. You have to administer with love, and corporal punishment should be, for the extreme cases. We don't want to have the environment like you and a lot of children grew up in, where, you get something wrong and you get hit. That's not administering corporal punishment properly. If you have a fight, or someone jumps on someone in our environment, well, that's a major problem. And corporal punishment, may come into play in that situation. But
would that include, for instance, would you include, say, like my brother has this philosophy. He doesn't have any kids, so I don't listen to half his philosophy. But his philosophy about disciplining kids, he always tells me. So when he watches, I want him to hear this. But he always says, well, when I have kids, I'm just gonna I'm not gonna spank them. I'm just gonna make them do exercises and carry books around and that sort of thing, right? And I said, well, hey, that very may work. Is that something that you guys do? Because I remember playing football as a kid, and those were the kinds of punishments we got as well. So you get in trouble, you're running extra laps, that sort of thing. Is that included in the discipline there, or?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, because it always comes down to, discipline it comes hand in hand with self-control. And children, a lot of times as adults, we almost take the position that children are setting out to do this. They're looking forward to, when they get up in the morning, to cause problems. but a lot of times the issue is discipline and self-control, self-discipline. So to punish someone for a bad behavior that is just that, a behavior, is not always, I mean, it's just not good.
Sure.
So working with them on responsibility and working with them on developing consistent good behaviors and being organized, especially with boys, because that's what frustrates mothers and teachers so much,
Sure,
you know, the
sure.
lack of organization and structure,
Yeah.
or, you know, not being able to be consistent on simple,
Sure.
you know.
Yeah, I think
routines.
if I were a kid, I probably would be more afraid of running laps in the gym than even getting getting spanked or something like
But
that.
your example was a good one with the football, doing the extra laps. When I was in high school, I really wanted to wrestle, and the extra laps, that type of punishment worked because I wanted to be on the wrestling team. It seems as though you're having to get people that don't care, work with them, and then try to get them to care, because administering anything punitive is not going to work, like I said earlier. So it's just two separate situations.
You know, one of the things that I've read is that social isolation, okay, and it may sound horrible, but there are theories that believe that social isolation is effective. So say you're acting out with a group of people, and then that one kid that gets in trouble has to now be over here away from all of his friends, and that tends to be effective. It's one of the reasons why people advocate for suspensions. And maybe there's a way not to suspend students in that way, but maybe there is a way to pull them back, and now they've got to sit in the office for 3 hours, and that typically, that tends to be very effective.
Depends on what you have them doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it depends on the child. I think sometimes in our society we try to do this one size fits all. Like,
That's
what is
important
the
too, yeah.
answer? And there is no one answer. I think it's multifaceted. And I think just like we try to differentiate in classrooms with learning, we have to differentiate in terms of what's really happening when children do act out or when they do have issues. Because social isolation, i.e., let's say I'm going to take you off the basketball team for a week, might work with one child, but would never work with the other. And in fact, might turn him off and turn him back to the streets. And so it's really knowing the kids and knowing the population intimately that you're dealing with, and not just knowing Mark, but knowing Mark and what's going on in his home and so on and so forth. I think that's a really important point.
Well, that ties into the truancy question, because truancy is obviously a big issue as well. In Chicago public schools, nearly 32,000 students in kindergarten through 8th grade missed 4 weeks or more in class during the 2010-2011 school year. And that's 1 in 8 kids. So you have this question, and I think back to the suspension issue. I'm not an advocate for suspensions necessarily, but when you look at this, suspensions really, they kind of play into this truancy issue as well. Because if you've got a kid that is already kind of shaky in attendance, or already shaky in commitment to being at school, and then you suspend them, then it just sort of exacerbates the problem with truancy.
It's the same problem.
Right. So how do we deal with, that's another question, another issue, but I'd be very interested in hearing about that, because we no longer have truancy officers in the city. It's been 2 decades now since we've had them.
I'm not sure
how do we
can
deal with that?
legislate it, and I'm not sure it's really a sort of a citywide or nationwide problem. I mean, the truth is, it really is commonsensical. I mean, when we all grew up, we perhaps grew up in households where it wasn't even in the sort of the agenda to not go to school, right? You didn't even imagine or fathom not going to school, but that's because we had parents that made sure that we had to go to school. And the question is maybe, perhaps beyond, it's really something that has a solution beyond our schools. And I think it goes back to what Nick was talking about earlier. Perhaps it is, ensuring for better structures of family. Perhaps it does have to do with going back to truancy officers, but the truth is we had truancy officers and still had the problem of truancy. So, the question of what do we do about truancy really is something that is multifaceted. It's not something that you could resolve at the schools alone, at the society level alone, or at the policy level. It really is something that's familial and something that is beyond the schools.
Truancy is actually a family issue, and it's more about the parents than it is about the child.
Yeah.
I mean, when someone's a minor, truancy should be addressed, to the parents. Why are you allowing this child to miss school? What help do you need? What can we do to help you?
Sure.
More than the child.
Sure.
Right. And I think sometimes, too, what happens is, you call home and the parent's like, well, I can't do anything for you. And so it really is incumbent upon the school. Again, that relationship piece is so critical. And so at our school, we have what's called student advocates. So I have 2 full-time people, and their responsibility is to make sure they're making connections. So if Mark doesn't show up to school, we're going out to Mark's house by 8:30 a.m. to go get Mark. Mark, you need to come to school. And so building that relationship with the kids.
I've read that in Galesburg, Illinois, and also in Los Angeles. One thing they've done about truancy, they actually find parents.
It's a great idea.
And it has proven to cut the truancy numbers. Is that something we advocate when you talk about parental responsibility and parental involvement in this? I mean, I see Khalil looking over there like, no, I think he's still going back, reliving those days back then, the corporal punishment. I think Khalil's like, no more punishment for anything, you know?
The beatings.
So so maybe there are ways, Khalil, to have incentives for positive behavior.
Right.
And, you know, so what do we think about that?
I think to start and try it and see how it goes wouldn't be a bad idea. I do have a question though. What's truancy like at your school? Or your schools, rather?
Well, you know, we really don't have
probably don't have it,
a situation with truancy.
Yeah.
Right.
But, you know, the interesting thing is when you were talking, you know, the issue of being absent is a problem. Yeah. Absent, tardy. But even in our workplace, in the American workplace, tardiness and absenteeism is a problem.
Yeah.
Also. So, you know, I would agree with Khalil. You know, there's an issue with families. And you know, maybe it's a broader issue with the stress and the things that are going on where families need support. Because in the past, I've agreed with that, and I'm familiar with the districts in some areas fining parents. But then on the other side, you know, what can we do with families to build that relationship that you were talking
Because
about?
if a family's having challenges anyway, you know, you throwing fines on them, maybe not necessarily.
Right, you work with them, and if they don't want to work with you, then you let them know, hey, if you don't work with us to solve this problem, you're going to be fined.
Right.
And make it an incentive, perhaps, to start seeing the light.
Well, we're going to be wrapping up this conversation in a second here, but here's what I feel like is being said, okay? I learned this strategy for relationship building in one of a workshop I did earlier. So when you're talking to someone, you say, what I hear you saying is this, so you don't offend them or say you did this or whatever. So what I hear you guys saying is, this comes back to family. And Lyndon Johnson had this amazing quote that he gave in the 60s that said literally that all of the social problems that we have really come back to the family. And unless we work to strengthen the family and create conditions by which people will stay together and raise kids and be responsible in that way, then all of the social spending that we deal with really is a lot less effective. So I think what we've come up with, which makes sense, is we've got to support families and we've got to help families do these roles. And maybe there's positive incentives and maybe there are negative incentives as well. But I thank you guys so much. And I appreciate this, and I do hope that we can begin a conversation moving forward. It's very important. So thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
That's our show for today. The conversation continues online at wycc.org. We'll see you next time on The Professors.